So this morning, this is kind of the guide to academic writing 1. Next week's will be more practical in the sense that we will actually do some writing together or do some writing exercises. But this week is just kind of going through what it means to write at the graduate level, particularly what it means to write in theological education. So this lesson workshop is titled Writing a Paper and Making it Plain. Thinking through 3 big things. Number 1, what makes for a quote unquote good paper? However we want to define good. Secondly, how can we write effectively? So thinking, how is it that we get to whatever we consider this good paper or this good theological graduate level writing? And importantly, I think for me, is how can we write in order to join the conversation, recognizing that our writing is just a piece of what everybody else is already talking about, regardless of the theme. And so thinking through how we can write in ways that are conducive to joining a conversation of ongoing scholars and thinkers. And we'll begin with some opening questions broadly. How do you know, these are 3 sets of questions, but they're all really related. How do you know when you've read a good paper? How is it written? Who is the audience? Where are helpful examples to be found? And when is a paper more than an assignment? So we'll take maybe 3 or 4 minutes and kind of jot down our initial thoughts to these questions, and then come back and share. Maybe 1 more minute. Okay, how do we know when we've read a good paper? What are the markers? Mm-hmm. Excellent. What about papers or writing that isn't academic? How do we know when it's good? Or what makes us think it's good? There may still be an argument or some type of persuasion toward a new way of thinking or being in the world. So there's clarity or streamline. Yeah, I think that's important too. We kind of frame this up under the notion of, particularly academic writing, there being a thesis. But all that means is that there's a line of thought, right? That it's leading somewhere. There's one type of argument we're trying to make. In one paper, we're not trying to make 8 arguments. We're trying to make 1. When, this last question is important. When is a paper more than an assignment? I think so, yeah. I think also when we care, right? we can all think of plenty of assignments that we have that we do because they were assigned. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we have invested ourselves into it as a paper that we really want to dig out and excavate something new or something creative. We might just be trying to please the professor and complete the assignment. But sometimes whatever the subject matter is becomes for us a paper. It becomes where we really are investing the argument with our own passion, our own ideas. We have some type of interest. This scripture from the Hebrew text, then the Lord answered me and said, write the vision, make it plain on tablets so that a runner may read it. For there is still a vision for the appointed time. It speaks of the end and does not lie. If it seems to tarry, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. I put this up because although this is kind of in the genre of prophetic literature, there is a command here from Yahweh to this person to write the vision, whatever they are seeing, to write it down and to make it plain so that others can engage it, right? So that the runner can read it. And what I think is particular for us, particularly in theological education, is that there is still this second part, right? There is a vision for the appointed time, right? We enter into seminary at a very particular time in history. I didn't go to seminary during a pandemic, but y'all are. And there means there are certain things to say in this moment, or there's certain things that, certain insights and certain epistemologies that will come out of this time that deserve to be written down, that deserve to be thought through and investigated. And so I adapted to say, write the paper and make it plain. Whatever it is, whatever that assignment is, write it, put pen to paper, put something so that people can read it and engage it. The first thing to think about before practical things is that we are always guided by, minimize this, there we go. That we are always guided by our questions. What brings us to write a certain paper or essay or op-ed or what have you are the questions that we bring to it, the curiosities that we have. So the first one is that writing always has an investment, and that's okay. It is okay that we are interested in what we're interested in and that we have whatever particular questions we are asking. Everyone isn't going to write the same thing because everyone doesn't have the same interest. Everyone isn't asking the same questions. So it is perfectly okay that our writing has the investment that we have, and that's what we want to interrogate. I've said this in here before, but one can write in the first person, right? It is important because this is our questions. These are our, this is our investment into what we're writing. And it's okay for us to say at times, I believe, or I am led to believe, or I want to argue X, Y, Z, because it is I doing it. First person isn't required all the time, and we don't want to use it to excess, but it is okay to use it. The questions, I'm going backwards between the last two. The questions serve as our guide, which then means we have to answer that third one. What questions or curiosities are guiding our work? Not only for particular assignments, although that's important, but what brought us into the space, even into Cantor, right? There are questions that we're wondering about. There are curiosities that we're chasing. There are themes that we want to investigate. There are places that we want to go in our mind that we have not yet visited. And these are the ways that bring us into the space. And those are our guide, right? When we get lost or confused, or when the writing isn't clear and we can't find our way through, we return to our questions and say, well, what is it that I'm actually interested in here? What is it that I'm wanting to respond to? What conversation is it that I want to join? I know it's so beaten into people to not do it. And in some fields, that's true. I think, this is just not true as exclusively for theological education. I was reading a book yesterday, even by a systematic theologian, who uses first person all over the place because it's still theology, right? Where it's still a personal investment into what claims we're making about the divine. And regardless of how some people would like to think, these claims are not objective. They are very much rooted in our location, our social location, our academic training, our own, arguments that our own biases that we're trying to, put forth, they are very much still connected to the first person. And so it's better, I think, sometimes to name that. This is where I'm thinking, or this is my conclusion, rather than trying to make it seem like it is a broad, objective, universal conclusion. Sure. So I think we do that in 3 ways. Good morning. I think we do that in 3 ways. I think the first part of writing effectively is situating itself within whatever we're trying to say. What is the hypothesis or the claim or this leading question? In other words, this is what I think is happening here. I don't know yet, right? This is where my questions come in. These are the things I'm curious in, or the things I'm questioning, things I want to investigate. But this is what I think is happening here. In academic writing, this often becomes what? The thesis, right? We're told to make a claim, to put something forward and say, this is what I'm going to argue. This is what I believe is happening here. Excellent question that I'm going to get to in just a minute. Yeah, I bring up that academics call this a thesis for a reason, because I think it gets rid of, in a lot of ways, the hypothesis, which is sitting with the question. And in the writing process, we don't want to rush so quickly to trying to say what we think is happening until we have figured out what is happening, right? Until we've done the writing. Which gets to the second one, right? There's already people talking about this. So first, we have our question or our claim or our hypothesis. Secondly, though, we want to engage the field. We want to offer a substantive inquiry into the current conversation. Or this is what others have said or are saying about this. Even our questions that are specific, right? So a minute ago, thinking about the pandemic. The novel coronavirus 19 is a specific instance that no one has encountered before. However, pandemics and epidemics are part and parcel with human history, right? That's why last year we saw all these people saying, well, when the Spanish flu of 1919 happened, or when the Black Plague, everyone was trying to make references to ongoing conversations, to how people have responded to this historically, because we're entering these conversations that are ongoing. And so even though we are situated in our present moment, more than likely the topic or the theme or the question, people have been talking about and people have been writing about. And that does not mean that we should not also talk or write about it, but that means we have the responsibility to engage what everyone else is saying, which is why I put this asterisk, right? We have to read enough then to know, to get a good sense of how the question will unfold. There are so many times, and I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing, but there are so many times when I'll read a paper that a student's written and they're coming up with a really brilliant conclusion. But then I'm like, okay, yeah, but theologian so-and-so said this 30 years ago. They just don't know it. They haven't read to know, so they think they're the first one to think this. And it's like, oh no, like someone already said that, which isn't a bad thing, right? But that person could have relied upon this theologian to help their argument, because this is already an ongoing conversation. Which then is the third, yes. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I don't think there's anything wrong with it just because we don't know what we don't know. What happens though, a lot of times when we are able to read more and engage other people on the topic, is that doesn't mean that what we have to say isn't worth saying, because more than likely, thinking back to 2 or 3 slides ago about our questions, we are still coming from our particular social location and our particular historical moment. And there are probably ways in which we're responding or interpreting this topic or theme differently than they are, right? So even if we have the same conclusion, we're going to present it in very different ways. It's going to still emerge from a very different context. And probably it's going to move toward a very different application. I think about this in terms of let's take, let me think of a good example. A good example is not coming to me. But I think about this basically in terms of how we might offer the same theological response to sin, right? Sin. We all can say, okay, sin is bad. We agree, cool. But based upon our social location, based upon our religious tradition, based upon our own history or experience, the way we write about sin, the four of us could all write a paper about sin, and we're going to get four different papers, which doesn't mean that all of us shouldn't write just because we're going to all say sin's bad. The ways in which we're articulating that are still going to be very unique to who we are. Which then gets to the third one. We have what we think is happening here or what's going on. We engage the current conversation of people and others talking about it. Then we offer a contribution to the conversation. So I'm going back 2 slides. So if you're writing, I'm coming right back. One, this is what I think is happening here, whatever my claim is, whatever my thought is. 2, this is what others have said or are saying about this. And then we end with, this is where the research has led me. This is what I can reasonably demonstrate and articulate my thoughts. This is important because if we want our writing to do something, it has to be in conversation, right? We want people to engage it. And in the same way that we are reading others, we want others to read us, which means we're joining this conversation. We are a part of it. And hopefully we're making a contribution. We're saying something new that is new to the conversation or that offers a nuance to the conversation. What questions do you have so far? I think, yeah, there are some people. I did a workshop yesterday with MTS students, and one of them brought up how, some people say, you should write at least a paragraph every day. Just write every day. I don't agree with that. I think sometimes you can, but other times you just don't need to. You need to read, right? So much of writing is reading what everybody else is saying. And not only that, I was told this in seminary by our dean. She said, not only do you need to read what people are saying about the conversation, you also just need to read good writing, whether that's James Baldwin or Toni Morrison or whatever the top writer for you might be. You just need to read good writing. So you get in your head the sentence structures and the emphatic, the emphases and the storytelling. You get in your head, this is what good writing is. And this is what good writing does. There have been whole college graduate level courses taught on literature of Toni Morrison. She's writing a novel, but in it is theory. So, she's still doing something with her writing that isn't considered, it's not written like a paper. But all of y'all read Toni Morrison, right? Think about Beloved. The theory that is in Beloved is not put forth in the same way we would in an academic paper. It comes to you in a different way. So part of it's just reading good writing to say, how do people write well? And how does writing affect us? Literally using kind of like affect theory or affectation. What does writing do to us? How does it move upon us? And where is it that we get moved? What writing is it that we're reading that does that for us, academic or not? And how can we put that into our writing? How can we, this is what I would always want to challenge people, how do we write academic papers like a Toni Morrison rather than this stuffy kind of 3-point, here's my introduction and my conclusion, right? What is the way in which we can be more generative in writing? Does that answer your question? I think writing, you do want to write often, but I don't think this like writing for a paragraph every day does any good if you're just writing the same way you did the day before and the day before and the day before. You're not really improving upon writing. So part of it is you have to try to write differently if you're going to write consistently. And part of that comes from reading. And part of that comes from sharing your writing. Maybe creating a writing small group where you all share your writing with each other every 2 weeks or something. Or you are open to feedback. That is important too. Okay, I'm going to move on to this. I'm going to ask if someone will read for us these verses from the Gospel of Matthew. Thank you. Using this as an example or a case study of what writing we just explored, where do you see in here the three parts? So let's start with the first one. What is the question? What's the broad theme being explored here? Sure, that's a part of it. What else? But failure to whom though? Not necessarily to God in this passage, right? To one another, right? We get brother and sister, brother and sister. All of this is formed under the idea of right relationships, right? Where is there an engagement with the field? You got it, right? This is Jesus, if he's writing this paper, right? Thinking about how do we be in right relationships with each other. So that's his question, right? That's his theme. I'm wondering about how people are supposed to be in right relationship. I'm wondering how to be in healthy relationships with each other. The engagement with the field, you've heard it said, right? Other people are saying don't murder. That's what they're saying is to be in right relationship is don't murder. And then where does his contribution to the conversation? Yeah, but I'm saying, right? It's not even about murder, it's about anger. You don't even have to go as far as to kill them, even if you are angry with them, or if you insult them, or if you call them a fool. That is straining this right relationship. Does that make sense? So we start with whatever our theme is. That's still our guiding question. We don't have to name that. But then we got to think about what everybody else is saying. They're saying it has to do with murder. And this has been a long-standing tradition. His contribution to the conversation is it's really even less about murder as much as it is about intention. It's about anger. It's about what we think about the other person. This is an engagement to the field, right? He's not ignoring what everybody else is saying, but he is offering his own contribution to the conversation in a way that is generative for us to use today. Make sense? This, what you just saw here, could be a possible structure for any paper, right? You can offer a short summary of the current research, what everybody else is saying. But the bulk of the paper is your stuff, right? The contribution to the conversation that you prove. It's backed up by whatever research you're doing, or it's backed up by whatever experience you're going to name. But your contribution is what we want to see in papers. I will name this as different, and we'll talk about this in just a second. This is different depending upon the field. So, I mean, if you're writing a paper for a history of Christianity, and you're being asked to make an argument about what has happened, then there's not really much opinion for you of what happened or not. It's just crafting the narrative in a certain way of what happened. These kinds of papers, though, where you're asked to make a contribution, are probably the ones you're going to find more in theology or ethics or pastoral care, or other ones that are more current, and other ones that don't necessarily have to rely so much on data. So some helpful notes is that any paper should be riddled throughout with your argument, not your opinion. Someone tell us what's the difference between an argument and an opinion. Absolutely, right? Your argument's backed up. A lot of times students will try to just riddle their opinion through a paper, but that does not give the reader, or if it's for a class, the professor, anything to go off of, right? Where does this opinion come from? How is it founded? Maybe thinking back to the 3 steps, right? Maybe you have a hypothesis, you have an opinion or an idea, but the research actually suggests the exact opposite. And I can't tell you how many times I have read a paper from someone who was just committed to making their point, even if all the research says otherwise. They still will do it, right? And they'll just try to pick the right parts of the research to make it look like it's right, until you give it to someone who's read what you're citing and says, this this is not true, right? We can have an opinion, but sometimes we have to be willing to have our opinion proven wrong. And that's what becomes an argument, right? We have some way to back up what we're saying. I tell everyone, write your introductions last. I think it's just good practice because oftentimes we start sitting down with our paper, empty Word doc, and the first thing we want to do is try to type an introduction. But we don't know what we're going to say yet. You know, we haven't written the paper. And that's where we get stuck a lot of times writing the introduction because we don't know how to start writing introduction because we didn't write the paper yet. So I say just don't do the introduction, skip it to begin with. Start with the bulk of the paper. Start with whatever research you're citing. You know, you can move on to those two things of what everybody else is saying and what you're going to say. And then you can go back at the end and write the introduction once you've figured out what you've actually said. Yes. Yeah, I think it depends on how you're structuring your writing process. So some people make from the beginning, have all the research, know exactly what point they're going to make, have a strong outline, in which case that's different. A lot of times, students really have all the research in front of them and just are trying to write. And they put an introduction in the beginning and they slap a thesis on there because they feel like they're supposed to have one. But then they go to writing and they don't actually write what they said their thesis was, right? Because they haven't done the writing yet. They haven't done the work yet. And it's the same way we talked about a few weeks ago with journaling, right? A lot of times we don't know what we want to say until we say it. We figure out what we want to write as we're writing it. And so a lot of times it's through the writing that we figure out what our thesis is, even if we think from the beginning it's something else, right? It's when we actually start writing and we're like, oh, this is actually not what I said I'm going to argue. And I'll say another word about that in a minute when we get to revisions. And then lastly, you know, as the title of this workshop, write the paper and make it plain. Even as you're writing, don't try to obfuscate things or to make it dense for no reason. You know, make it to where the reader can understand what you're saying. Otherwise, the contribution to the conversation is muddled, and no one can contribute or engage with your stuff because they can't understand it. It's not clear. It's not plain. And I don't say plain in the sense of, you know, don't be using third grade words, but I mean plain in the sense of clarity, where someone can engage it and run with it. Here we go, words on revisions. My thought, my hypothesis is that good papers are not written, they are revised. The very first draft we write or the very first thing we put out might be shit. It might just be garbage, you know? That's why we revise. 3 stages to the writing process: pre-writing, writing, revision. And all 3 of them are important. That first bullet point gets at your question, right? When you're thinking about revision, you have to first look at, do I argue what I said I will argue? I could have a thesis statement. I could put, you know, a strong introduction and say, this is what I'm going to talk about. But then my paper talks about something completely different. Or I have put in my thesis, this is what point I'm going to make by the end. And even though I'm talking about that same subject, I don't actually make that point. That is disconcerting for a reader who is looking the whole time for the point you said you were going to make, right? And that's fine. Maybe you didn't make that point or you made another one. So in revision, you either need to revise what you said was your thesis or what you said you were going to make, or you need to revise the argument, right, to make sure it lines up. And does the logic flow? So sometimes you do have a point you're making that is well substantiated, but it's confusing for the reader because you put kind of things in an order logically that doesn't make sense. So you're introducing terms, you're talking about terms in part 1 of your essay that you don't introduce into the 3rd section, right? And so to you, it makes sense because you already know what you're writing about, but you don't actually talk about what you mean until the 3rd section. And then on the first part, the reader's confused, right? So we have to then, there's literally a practice. I'm not going to recommend it unless you think you want to do it. There's literally a practice for some people who in revision who will print out their entire paper and cut it by paragraphs. And if necessary, we'll physically move paragraphs around, right? Because part of revision is not just moving around words within a sentence or even moving around sentences within a paragraph. Sometimes it's moving around entire paragraphs, right? This argument would flow better if this section actually all moves to the front, right? You don't know that until you've first written a whole draft and give yourself enough time and space to revise. I know with seminary, we're just trying to get the stuff in, right? I already know when you have the time or when you make the time for revision, you will have a stronger paper, always. No one revises a paper and it turns worse, right? Particularly if you're revising it with other people. So if you have whatever type of writing group that you're sharing each other's stuff with, get other eyes on it, because then someone else can tell you, this doesn't make sense, or this doesn't flow. Or I see what you're trying to do, but you're missing this one piece, that you should maybe add another paragraph to explain, right? But then the last two, of course, are always part of revision. Have you spell checked? Is the grammar and syntax correct? If need be, have you visited the writing center? Remembering, that you can visit the writing center at any point of the writing process. Yes, Terry. Oh yeah, I use Grammarly. Oh yeah, because sometimes it's about clarity, right? And so there are phrases that I use that are 3 words that Grammarly will say you only need 1. No. Mm-mm. No. We need to have things to help us write clearer. Grammarly, particularly, because a Microsoft Word is going to tell you if you misspelled something or whatever, which Grammarly will do as well. But what I get from Grammarly really has to do with those other things, where I'll say, what did I do? I'm just country, so I just say a lot of things that don't make sense. And I was typing it in an email yesterday and put like 4 words. If this is going to be about whatever, and Grammarly was like, just say 2, or something like that. Whereas I'm just kind of making things less clear. Grammarly is saying that's not clear. Make it clear. Yeah. Let me see where I'm going next. Oh yeah. So there's also, I mentioned this earlier, but there are different styles of writing for different fields. So again, for history papers, for social sciences, they are still very much driven on facts and data, very research oriented. This does not mean that they are excluded from our personal investment, though. We still have a point we're trying to make. There's still questions that are guiding what we're doing, but the way in which we're making that argument or the way in which we're writing it is going to be a bit different for the field. Theology and ethics situates itself really on those questions and on those claims, and in large part on those imperatives. So the questions don't always get resolved, or the claims don't always get fully responded to. There are sometimes imperatives, there are moral things that we're trying to grapple with, and the grappling is okay, right? Trying to think about how to be in the world. Homiletics and pastoral care is really the primary place where you're going to be using first person. It's going to be very reflective, introspective. And with homiletics, right, there's going to be some exhortations, right? It might even be, there's often in preaching, right, second person, which we wouldn't really see anywhere else. But it's very much where you need to, or we must, right? In order for you to get ahead, you need to, right? It's very much second person exhortations, a different style of writing. All of these styles of writing are still motivated by the questions and our curiosities, but it's the style that is different. And so it's important to distinguish between them. I had a student come to the Writing Center last week who was writing a theology paper, and her professor had written on there that it sounds too much like a sermon, right? Because she's exhorting, she's writing in like a second person, whatever. And that doesn't mean that type of writing is bad, but it's not writing that belongs in this field. That type of writing is for preaching or maybe pastoral care. But theology ethics does not use exhortations or this kind of preachy kind of, way. And I think all of us have one kind of mode that we fall back on in writing, one type of style that we're most comfortable with. And we have to be able to separate, not even separate, we have to be able to write in different modes, right? We have to be able to be adept in writing for different fields. Questions on that? All right, almost done. The last part, which I've mentioned before, but here's some more direct things, is again, all of our writing is to join the conversation, no matter what field it's from. It is so that we are contributing to this ongoing conversation of thinkers and scholars. So, although I said earlier that those questions, our curiosities, are our guide, Other writings are our peers. We're all trying to get at the same questions or the same themes. And so the people who have already written about it or the people who are writing alongside us, we're not in competition. We're also not in contestation or conflict, right? We're all trying to think about this question or these themes. So these are our peers. These are interlocutors, right? People with whom we may be able to talk. I say also we enter into an ongoing conversation. So even though these current writings are our peers, all of us are writing after people have been writing about this for years. When we think about sin, even, people have been writing about sin for, I don't know, 3,000 something years. You know, like none of this is new. Even though we have particular sections that we're focusing on, or we have a particular location that we're writing out of, we enter into a conversation that has long been ongoing. And I say this also for the flip side. We want to make sure then that our writing and whatever claims we're making can be engaged for generations after us, right? So that the conversation has continuity, and so that the theological and intellectual inquiry has continuity. So we enter into an ongoing conversation at other points, so will other people. We are just a part of it. And the last one, which I think is important for me to think about always, and important for us, when we are writing, particularly when we're writing in theological education, we're often writing about people and the way they understand faith, where they understand practices of faith, where they understand their bodies, or where they understand social things or politics, whatever, right? It's very much rooted in people. And I think for me, that requires us to think about stewardship. And how do we best steward the people and the thoughts that are involved in our work? Academic work tries to make itself seem like it's detached. It is not. That's why I emphasize over and over again that we have investments, that we have personal questions involved in this. And so we have to then think, how do I steward this in a way that's responsible? What is an ethic of care that I can establish in my writing so that I'm not marginalizing, so that I'm not misrepresenting, so that I'm not discounting or ignoring or misappropriating people, right? The people about whom I'm writing even. So I think that's important for all of us to think about, is making sure we have a solid ethic of care, a responsible stewardship for who we're writing about, and the thoughts we're writing about, and how those thoughts affect people. Y'all have all been through the very first, almost the end of the semester for Hebrew Bible. There are some things in Hebrew Bible you learn that really do shake your foundations if you were taught something else, right? So even though this thought itself, 2-3 years from now will seem old hat to you and you just know it, in the moment it was shocking. And particularly for a lot of people in the class who come from different backgrounds, those thoughts shift who they think they are, right? These are connected to their personhood and their identity, their communities. So we have to be caring in the way we deal with even thoughts, because they're very powerful. They hold a lot for us. And we have to be sure we're stewarding those well. Do y'all have questions? What is Judges? I don't. What is Judges 19, first off? I don't know the Bible that well. Oh, okay. Okay. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. And so you're saying what about it? Right. I'm wondering what your question is about writing about, though. Got okay, I see. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Marginalizing and misrepresenting, I was saying in terms of people, not necessarily like text in that way. You could you could make right, you could make an argument about the place of the text, about questioning the place of the text. That I don't think that comes off as misrepresenting the authors of Judges. No. I mean, we have whole books. Phyllis Tribble has, whole works. Francis Taylor Ginch, all these other people have talked about these texts of terror, because that's what they are, terrifying. Um, what is striking to me though about texts like that and texts from Judges about Jephthah's daughter and other ones is, what are we to do with it? You know, so we can write all day long saying, this is gratuitous violence and this is um, questioning even the fact that it's in the canon. But then we have to kind of take it to the next step, which is, well, what are we to do about it? It is in the canon, and it is gratuitous, and it is violent. And I'm saying this because I think this is where I would draw your attention back to the questions that you have, right? Those questions are our guides, whatever those broad questions are. And so there's a reason that you're rubbing up against it, right? There's a reason that you particularly find tension with that text. Trace that. What is it really here that's underneath it for you? And how can you write toward that end? That uses this as an example, but more than likely, your hesitation with the text isn't just about Judges 19, right? It's about perhaps its application in different ways. It's about how it might be used toward domestic violence, or there's something else that we have to get to. And so, yeah. So you could make that argument. It wouldn't be an argument that I would make, but you could make it. I don't think it can be skipped because it's there. We have to do something with it, right? Otherwise, we're just kind of doing like this and saying, well, I don't want to see it. But that doesn't mean it's not there. And then in many ways, that also could be harmful to those who are modern recipients of violence, right? We can't just not see it. It is there. So we have to do something. We have to respond to it. And that's why I think it's helpful. What is the response to it? We can say it's here and it is gratuitous and it is violent and it should be condemned, right? And we should have people working against it, or we can make that into a response. But even Jephthah's daughter, it's there. We have to engage it. There's stuff from the New Testament even that is just, to me, like, what? I do not want to talk. It just seems irrelevant to me. And yet I know there are entire communities of faith, modern communities of faith, basing their theology off the verses I don't want to pay attention to, right? I personally don't think anything about the household codes. Husband obey your, women obey your husband. Blah, blah, blah. I don't even think about it. And yet there are entire denominations and religious communities who make that the basis of how they teach family and children, right? I mean, part of the great thing about theological education then is then we are supposed to be countering this kind of stuff, right? Offering alternative engagements, or alternative interpretations. Mm-hmm. And more importantly, I think, particularly when it comes to anything about scripture, we're asking questions about, what does this say about the divine? We can shift the attention to the compilers or to Jephthah himself, or we can kind of obfuscate that. But all of what we're thinking about with scripture is how does this relate to the divine's presence in the story or not, right? There are some stories in the biblical text where some people would say the divine was not present in this, right? But because it's in this book, it's in this collection, that's what we have to question. Why is it here? What are we supposed to think from this? And what were modern readers at the time thinking of this? Right? When we see the household codes, okay, so to us it seems just like an affront. But there was a particular reasoning for its presence, and there was probably a different reading for those at the time. I think we're right at 9:35. So if you do have other questions, as always, feel free to email me or catch me anytime in the week. But thanks for coming. Be well. Next week is the second part to this, but we're not doing tips or whatever. We're going to actually kind of do some writing exercises together. So come prepared for that if you choose to. But other than that, be well. Yeah, thank you.